After my grandmother's notary handed each of us a sealed envelope at the reading of her will, I noticed something none of my cousins thought to check. Mine was heavier. We were sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Elgin Street in Ottawa, the same street my grandmother had walked to work every morning for 32 years. And the four of us, Bridget and Miles on one side of the table, me and my brother Sebastian on the other, had each received what appeared to be identical cream envelopes with our names written in our grandmother's handwriting. Bridget held hers up to the window. Miles had already started tearing his open. Sebastian set his flat on the table and folded his hands over it like he was waiting for grace. Mine had something inside it besides paper. My grandmother's name was Genevieve Fontaine. She'd been born in a small town outside Gatineau, crossed the river into Ottawa at 22 with 2 suitcases and a practical grasp of English she'd taught herself from library books, and spent the next 4 decades building Fontaine Property Group from a single leased storefront on Somerset Street into a property management company that by the time she retired managed 14 commercial buildings across the capital region. She never described herself as an entrepreneur. She said she was a woman who had noticed early on that other people were bad at keeping track of things and had decided to be useful. She was 79 when she died in the spring. She'd had a stroke the previous autumn and spent those final months in a care home in Gloucester that I visited every Sunday until the last one. She never lost her sharpness entirely, but toward the end she sometimes confused the order of things. Not what had happened, but when. She'd describe an argument she'd had with a supplier in 1991 as though it had occurred last week. She'd ask me how my audit job was going, and then, 20 minutes later, ask whether I'd thought about going into finance. I had thought about it. 14 years earlier, in fact. I was 34. I worked as a senior financial auditor for a firm with offices in Ottawa and Toronto. My grandmother had been the reason I'd chosen that particular path, though I didn't tell her that until the autumn before she died. She'd looked at me for a long moment after I said it, and then nodded in a way that felt less like surprise, and more like confirmation of something she'd already worked out on her own. The envelope held 2 things, a USB drive, small and black, and a folded note in her handwriting that read, "You are the one who knows what to look for. I'm sorry it took me this long to trust that, G." The 4 of us opened our envelopes in the same room. Bridget's and Miles's held single sheets of paper, copies of the estate division, what we'd all been expecting. Sebastian's held the same, along with a handwritten letter I didn't ask to read. My Uncle Warren sat at the far end of the table in a dark gray suit that still had the dry cleaning tag tucked inside the collar. He'd been running Fontaine Property Group for 6 years by then, ever since my grandmother had stepped back from day-to-day operations. He watched me hold up the USB drive without saying anything, and then he looked at the window. I didn't say anything either. I put the drive in my jacket pocket and kept my hands still. To understand why that mattered, I need to tell you who my grandmother actually was, and how the family had let her story shrink in the retelling. Genevieve Fontaine had been, in the plainest terms, meticulous. She kept carbon copies of every lease she'd ever signed. She maintained a separate handwritten ledger alongside whatever accounting software her company used in any given decade, not because she distrusted technology, but because she'd told me once that the best way to catch a mistake was to keep 2 systems that had no reason to agree with each other. She balanced them every quarter. She had been doing this since 1987. When my Uncle Warren took over operations in 2018, she kept doing it. She did it quietly, without telling him, from her apartment in Centertown, using scanned invoices and digital statements. Her former bookkeeper, a woman named Miriam, who had worked for Fontaine Property Group for 21 years and retired 3 months before my grandmother did, had continued to forward until sometime in 2021. I don't know exactly when my grandmother realized what she was looking at. I know she didn't say anything to Warren. I know she didn't say anything to my mother, or to her own lawyer, or to any of the 3 accountants she'd worked with over the years. I know this because the USB drive contained 4 years of her parallel ledger, a folder of scanned bank statements, and a document she had written herself titled, "In the same plain way she did everything. Discrepancies I have found and what I believe they mean." She had been building a case file, alone, in her apartment, well into her late 70s. I didn't look at the drive the night of the will reading. I left it on my kitchen counter and went to bed. I told myself I was being careful. The truth is, I was afraid of what I'd already half understood the moment I felt the extra weight in that envelope. I looked at it the following evening, after dinner, with a glass of water I forgot to drink. I am not going to describe in full detail what I found, because I am still not certain which parts of these eventual proceedings are matters of public record and which aren't. What I can tell you is that my grandmother's parallel ledger showed a pattern that I recognized within the first hour of reading it. Because I had seen smaller versions of it in corporate audits over the years, and because the pattern has a specific shape that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. Over a period of roughly 4 years, management fees had been routed through a subsidiary company, a numbered Ontario corporation that appeared nowhere in Fontaine Property Group's public filings, but that showed up consistently in the internal accounts my grandmother had tracked, and from there into the hands of a man named Lachlan Briggs. He was my Uncle Warren's oldest friend. They had met at Carleton in the early 90s. I had met him exactly once, at a Christmas dinner in 2019, and remembered him as a man who laughed slightly too loudly at his own observations, and spent most of the meal talking to Warren about a development deal in Canada that I had tuned out within the first 5 minutes. The numbered company billed Fontaine Property Group for what the invoices called property management consulting services. There were no contracts attached to these invoices in the records my grandmother had collected. There were no deliverables, no reports, no correspondence between the subsidiary and the parent company that would justify the amounts. What there was, spread across 4 years, was roughly $4.3 million in transfers that my grandmother had flagged in her document with a single handwritten note. I do not believe this work was ever performed. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I closed the laptop, put the USB drive in my lockbox at home, and went to work the next morning as though I hadn't found anything at all. I want to be honest about what I chose to do next, because there's an easier version of this story where I confront my uncle right away, and everything resolves in one confrontation. That version is more satisfying to imagine. It would also have accomplished nothing except giving Warren time to cover whatever remained uncovered. I knew 2 things that mattered more than my anger. The first was that my grandmother had spent years documenting precisely because she understood that emotion without evidence is just noise. The second was that Fontaine Property Group had applied, 3 months before she died, for refinancing on its largest holding, a commercial building on Spark Street in the Byward Market area that anchored most of the company's rental income. Refinancing at that scale, through a major lender, required a full financial audit as a condition of the new mortgage terms. That audit had been delayed twice already. Based on the timeline I could see in the company's public filings, it was scheduled to begin in the autumn. I decided to wait. I hired a forensic accountant named Anaya Mehta, a woman I had worked alongside during a fraud investigation in Toronto 3 years earlier, and whose judgment I trusted more than almost anyone else I knew in that field. I told her what I had. She was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said, "Send me everything. And let's meet in person before you decide your next step." We met at her office on a Wednesday afternoon in July. We kept meeting every 2 weeks for the next 4 months. Anaya cross-referenced my grandmother's parallel ledger against Fontaine Property Group's filed financials and the records held by the Ontario Companies Registry, and she found what I had found, and then she found more. The numbered company had a companion, a second corporation registered in British Columbia, outside Ontario's immediate reporting reach, that had received a portion of the same funds before being dissolved in early 2022. Lachlan Briggs was listed as a director of both. We also found 2 former employees who were willing to speak to us. One was a property manager named Colton who had been let go in 2021 and who remembered being asked by my uncle to process certain invoices without attaching them to any specific property file. He hadn't understood why at the time and hadn't asked. The other was Miriam, my grandmother's former bookkeeper, who told us she had stopped forwarding documents to my grandmother in 2021, not because she'd been asked to stop, but because she had noticed someone else at the company had begun accessing the shared drive where those documents were stored, and it hadn't felt right to continue. Miriam said she'd spent 2 years wondering whether she should have said something sooner. I told her she had. She'd forwarded everything to my grandmother, who had written it all down. By October, I had a binder 2 inches thick and a clear sense of timing. The Spark Street refinancing audit was scheduled to begin on the 15th. I made one phone call to the lead auditor assigned by the lender. A call I won't describe in more detail than that. And on the morning of the 14th, I sat down with Fontaine Property Group's remaining board members in the same building on Elgin Street, where we had read the will, with Anaya beside me, and I laid out 4 years of documented misappropriation in terms that no one in that room could reasonably dismiss. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when people have suspected something for a long time and have just been handed permission to stop pretending they haven't. My Uncle Warren was not in the room. I had made sure of that. Within 6 weeks, Lachlan Briggs's companies were named in a civil claim filed through the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Within 10, Warren had resigned his position as managing director under terms his own lawyer had negotiated, a process I was not involved in and did not follow closely. Colton's account was included in the evidentiary record. Miriam provided a sworn statement. The BC Corporation had been dissolved, but forensic accountants have methods for reconstructing records that predate dissolution, and Anaya used all of them. My uncle came to my apartment on a Thursday evening in November. He didn't call ahead. He knocked 3 times, which was how he had always knocked. Quick and certain, the same knock from every holiday and every Sunday dinner I could remember, and I knew who it was before I opened the door. He was wearing a coat I recognized from years of Christmas gatherings and standing in the hallway of my building, looking older than he had 6 months ago in a way that wasn't just tiredness. He didn't lead with anger. That surprised me. I had expected anger. "You have no idea what was happening behind the scenes," he said. "The company was bleeding. She left me with leases that hadn't been renegotiated in a decade. I kept 3 buildings from going into default that she never would have known about. I told him I'd read her ledgers, all of them." Something shifted in his face. "She never said a word to me about any of this." "No," I said. "She didn't." He was quiet for a moment, then more quietly. "She always came around eventually. Every time I made a decision she didn't understand at first, she came around. She would have understood this too if I'd had the chance to sit down with her." I thought about the note she'd left me. I'm sorry it took me this long to trust that. I thought about 4 years of handwritten discrepancy logs kept in a Centertown apartment by a woman in her late 70s who had built something worth protecting and had watched it being taken apart from a distance, in silence, because the person doing it was her son, and she had loved him since before he could read, and love had made her hesitate too many times before it finally made her start writing things down. "Maybe she would have," I said, "but she spent 4 years writing it down instead of saying it to you. I think that's its own kind of answer." He didn't have anything to say to that. He left. He didn't knock again. The civil proceedings took most of the following year. The amount recovered through frozen accounts and forced asset liquidation was not the full $4.3 million. But it was substantial enough to matter to the company's balance sheet, and significant enough that the lender completed the Spark Street refinancing without conditions. Warren's personal exposure in the settlement was limited in ways that frustrated me at the time, and that I have since made a kind of peace with, because the alternative was years of litigation that would have consumed the company along with him. Lachlan Briggs's corporations bore the larger share of the judgment, which was appropriate, because he had structured them with precisely that liability in mind. 6 months after the settlement closed, my uncle sent me a letter. It was 3 paragraphs. It did not use the word sorry in the way that word usually gets used in these situations, deployed like a full stop, closing something off so the writer can move on. It was more careful than that. He wrote that he had told himself, for years, that he was making decisions my grandmother hadn't been positioned to see clearly, that he was protecting something she had built and could no longer fully understand. He wrote that he recognized now that protection and control are not the same thing, and that he had confused them for long enough that the confusion had become its own kind of harm. He wrote that he understood why she had stopped confiding in him long before she'd stopped speaking to him, and that he was sorry she'd had to carry that alone. It was honest in a way his early defense had not been. Honesty, even when it arrives late, is still worth something. I kept the letter. The board brought in a new managing director the following spring. A woman named Sandrine, who had spent 15 years in commercial real estate operations across Ontario and Quebec, and who within 8 months had renegotiated 2 of the legacy contracts Warren had cited as evidence of the company's insolvency. My mother, who had stayed quietly supportive through all of it, without ever once asking to see the binder or the ledgers, told me at dinner one evening that the quarterly numbers were the cleanest she had seen since she'd been on the company's advisory board in the early 2000s. She said it the way people say things they've been holding a long time, like relief that finally has somewhere to go. A year after my grandmother died, on a Sunday morning in May, the family gathered at Fontaine Property Group's offices for something that hadn't happened in years: a building opening. My grandmother had purchased a small mixed-use property on Preston Street in the final year before her retirement, and the renovation she had commissioned, quietly paused by my uncle for 2 years, under the cover of cash flow concerns, completed now with recovered funds and a new management team that actually wanted it finished, was done. There was a small reception on the ground floor. Someone had framed one of my grandmother's photographs near the door. A picture from the late 1980s of her standing in front of the Somerset storefront with her hands on her hips and an expression that was not quite a smile but was something better. The look of a woman who has just proven something she already knew. Bridget was there. Miles was there. Sebastian, who had quietly handed over his share of the Spark Street lease review to me without asking for an explanation, stood near the window talking to Miriam. Anaya had sent a card that arrived the day before, and that I read 3 times. I stood outside on Preston Street for a few minutes before going in a coat my grandmother had once complimented, and that I had kept for no other reason than that. The morning was cool and clear the way Ottawa mornings are in late spring, when the last of the winter has finally gone and you can feel the city exhale. I thought about the envelope that was heavier than the others. I thought about the USB drive sitting on my kitchen counter, and the glass of water I'd never drunk. I thought about 4 years of handwritten ledgers, kept by a woman who had decided that the most useful thing she could do with the time she had left was make sure that what she'd built didn't disappear quietly, without anyone being held responsible for the disappearing. She hadn't left me a secret to guard. She'd left me something to finish. I went inside.